The June heat of 1882 pressed down on Copper Ridge like a physical weight, turning the Arizona desert into a shimmering mirage of red rock and dust. Inside the Red Canyon Saloon, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. Clara Bennett moved through the haze like a ghost. Her tray balanced perfectly despite the uneven floorboards that creaked beneath her worn boots. 28 years old, with chestnut hair perpetually escaping its pins and a small scar cutting through her left eyebrow, Clara had learned to make herself invisible. It was a survival skill she'd perfected over 5 years of serving drinks to men who looked through her rather than at her. The scar was from the fire, the one that had taken her parents and younger brother, the one that had driven her west with nothing but grief and a desperate need to escape memories that burned worse than flames. The saloon was her sanctuary and her prison. Tom Wright, who owned the place, was decent enough, paid on time, didn't tolerate his customers getting too rough with the serving girls, even showed something like respect in his brown eyes when he spoke to Clara. But decency didn't change what she was in this town. Just another working woman scraping by in a place where copper dreams had turned to dust and desperation. The piano player, a one-eyed drunk named Charlie, was murdering a tune in the corner when the saloon doors swung open with enough force to slam against the walls. Conversations stuttered and died as Sheriff Marcus Dalton stepped inside, bringing with him an atmosphere that made Clara's skin prickle with warning. Dalton was a big man gone to fat, his once impressive frame now straining against his black vest. Silver threads ran through his hair, and his carefully groomed mustache did nothing to soften the cold calculation in his gray-blue eyes. The sheriff's star on his chest caught the lamplight, polished so bright it seemed to mock the tarnished souls of everyone who looked at it. He surveyed the saloon like a king inspecting his domain, and Clara felt his gaze slide over her with the same dismissive contempt he'd shown her 100 times before. She was beneath his notice, just another piece of furniture that occasionally brought him whiskey. "Evening, gentlemen." Dalton's voice filled the space, rich with self-satisfaction. And I use that term loosely, given the company. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. The miners and drifters who filled the saloon knew better than to cross the sheriff. Dalton had a reputation for creative justice arrests that happened in dark alleys, evidence that appeared conveniently, witnesses who suddenly remembered things differently. "Not so fast, sweetheart," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I'm parched, and you're going to fetch me a drink. That is what they pay you for, isn't it, being useful?" She carefully extracted her wrist from his grip, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. "And make it quick. Unlike some people, I have important work to do. Real work that actually matters." Clara nodded and turned toward the bar, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Behind the bar, Tom caught her eye, his expression concerned. He'd witnessed. She poured the whiskey, the good bottle. Tom kept under the bar for special occasions and customers who could afford it and carried it back to where Dalton had claimed the best table in the house, forcing 3 miners to relocate with nothing. Around them, the saloon had gone quiet again, that watchful silence that preceded either violence or entertainment. In Copper Ridge, the two were often indistinguishable. "No, Sheriff," she said softly. "What else can I get you?" Dalton leaned. "Like you've got opinions about your betters." Clara kept her voice level, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere past his left shoulder. "I don't think anything, Sheriff. I just serve drinks." "That's a lie," Dalton said, almost pleasantly. "Because at the end of the day, you're still just a saloon girl serving whiskey to men who actually built something with their lives." Each word was chosen to wound, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of. Maybe it was the particular smugness in Dalton's voice, or the way every man in the saloon was watching her endure this degradation, or simply that 5 years of swallowing insults had finally filled her. "You're right, Sheriff," she heard herself say, her voice carrying across the silent saloon with unexpected clarity. "I do think." Dalton's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" "I said you're right. The sheriff's expression shifted, smugness giving way to wariness. Around them, the saloon seemed to hold its breath. "I serve a lot of people," Dalton said carefully. "Can't be expected to remember every conversation." "Of course not." And Morrison counted out $200 and $20 bills, all in sequence, handed them to you. The silence that. "You're making up stories because you've got some kind of grudge. Am I making up the ledger in your office too?" Claire interrupted, and now there was no stopping the words that had been building for weeks. "Second drawer on the right, underneath the stack of wanted posters. There are 6 other names I didn't recognize." But she'd stood there for 20 minutes memorizing dates and names and amounts, knowing even then that this information was dangerous. Now watching Dalton's face cycle through shock and rage and calculation, Clara understood she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. There would be consequences. There would be retaliation. There might even. Around the saloon, miners were standing, their expressions shifting from shock to something harder, something that looked like fury finally finding a target. "Sheriff," Tom said quietly, "I think you're just a man with a badge who forgot what the badge was supposed to mean. The law is supposed to protect people, not prey on them." But then his gaze swept the saloon, the armed miners, Tom's shotgun, the unified wall of witnesses who would testify to whatever happened next, and his hand fell away from his weapon. He paused at the threshold, turning back to look at Clara with an expression that promised retribution. "You just signed your death warrant, girl," he said softly. Then he was gone, the saloon doors. The rage and courage that had fueled her confrontation drained away, leaving only fear and the sick certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake. "Clara," Tom's voice was gentle. She'd just accused the sheriff of Copper Ridge of corruption in front of a saloon full of witnesses. She'd threatened a man with a gun and a badge and zero conscience. What had she been thinking? Around them, the saloon was erupting into conversation, excited voices overlapping. Men arguing and speculating about what would happen next. An older man Clara recognized as a miner named John Peterson approached, his weathered face serious. "Lost 3 ore shipments to Morrison's gang in the past 6 months. And every time the sheriff was conveniently elsewhere. Men have tried to speak up before, but they ended up arrested on false charges or run out of town." He paused. "And we need to figure out what to do next, because Dalton's not going to let this slide." An older man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. "Reverend Marshal in Tucson," Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Local corruption requires federal intervention. If this ledger exists, as she says, it's proof of systematic criminal activity. Tucson, and we keep Clara safe until the marshal arrives." Clara listened to them planning her protection, her escape, her survival, and felt simultaneously grateful and guilty. These men, these rough miners and gamblers and drifters, were willing to risk themselves for her. Because it would have been funny if it wasn't so terrifying. "I need to get the ledger," Clara said, cutting through the planning. "From Dalton's office, before he realizes its evidence and destroys it." "Absolutely not," Tom said immediately. "That's suicide." The bitter truth of that statement hung in the air. Reverend Hayes studied her thoughtfully. The girl is right. Testimony without corroboration is weak, especially. But as Clara looked around the saloon at the faces of men who'd found their courage through her example, she understood that some. Clara and Reverend Hayes approached the office through the back alleys of Copper Ridge, moving through shadows cast by a moon so bright it turned the desert silver. The office door was locked, but the window latch. In the moonlight filtering through the windows, Clara could see Dalton's desk, the chair where he'd been passed out drunk, the cabinet where he kept his collection of wanted posters. She'd been stupid to think otherwise, stupid to hope he'd leave evidence of his crimes where anyone could find it. "Clara," Hayes's urgent whisper came from the window. "Someone's coming." She heard footsteps on the wooden planks outside, the jingle of the closet maybe, or under the desk. The door opened. Dalton stood silhouetted in the doorway, his Colt drawn and pointed directly at Clara's chest. In the moonlight, his expression was almost peaceful. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with his free hand. "It doesn't. It just makes you predictable." Clara raised her hand slowly, her mind racing. "Who do you think they'll believe? A respected lawman, or a dead saloon girl with a history of making wild accusations?" Dalton's smile was cold. "See, I've been thinking about this very carefully. There was nothing he could do without getting them both killed." Clara felt strange clarity settle over her fear. She was going to die. Here, in this office, that stank of corruption, shot by a man who'd killed justice long before he'd point his gun at her. "You'll probably get away with killing me tonight, but, Sheriff, you can't kill everyone who knows your secrets. Tom Wright knows. Reverend Hayes knows. Every person in that saloon tonight knows. You can't shoot." He crashed into Dalton's gun arm just as the Colt fired, the shot going wide and burying itself in the wall 6 inches from Clara's head. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, Hayes fighting with the crack of wood on skull was sickening and satisfying in equal measure. Dalton went limp. "Is he dead?" Clara whispered, the chair still raised for another blow. Hayes checked for a pulse, his hands shaking. "No, unconscious, but breathing. We need to go now, before he wakes." They reached the back entrance of the Red Canyon Saloon just as Tom burst through the door, shotgun in hand. "We heard a shot, Clara. Are you hurt?" "Dalton tried to kill me," she gasped out between ragged breaths. "Clara, can you write down everything you remember from that ledger?" She nodded. "Then do it. Every name, every date, every dollar amount. Reverend, we need you to ride to Tucson tonight. Take Clara's written testimony to the." She stayed in the room above the saloon, writing page after page of testimony, recreating the ledger from memory. Tom organized shifts of armed men to guard the building. He deputized men loyal to him and attempted to storm the saloon, but found himself facing too many armed defenders. He spread rumors that Clara was lying, mentally unstable, a scorned woman inventing stories. Clara watched from the window as they entered Copper Ridge, her heart in her throat. Dalton met them on Main Street, his sheriff's star catching the sunlight, trying to bluff his way through with authority and charm. As they led him past the Red Canyon Saloon, he looked up at the window where Clara stood watching. His expression promised vengeance, even in chains. She met his gaze steadily, and for the first time since that night she'd spoken up, Clara didn't feel afraid. The trial. Other witnesses came forward, miners who'd been extorted, business owners who'd paid protection money, even one of Dalton's own deputies who finally found the courage to speak truth. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. "The town council wants to offer you a position," he said as they walked back toward the saloon. "They're establishing a proper school, and they want you to run it," said anyone smart enough to memorize a ledger and brave enough to stand up to Dalton as smart. Smarter than most people with fancy degrees. And more importantly, you care about truth and justice. Those are things worth teaching. She thought about it, about staying in Copper Ridge, about building something instead of just surviving, about transforming a few nights a week at least. "This place, it matters to me. It's where I found my voice." Tom's smile was warm enough to chase away the desert chill. Deal. The Copper Ridge Community School opened its doors 6 months. Then she remembered standing in front of Sheriff Dalton, speaking truth when silence would have been safer. If she could face down a corrupt lawman with a gun, she could handle a classroom of children. "My name is Clara Bennett," she began. The students stared at her with wide eyes, not yet understanding what she meant, but they would. She would make sure they understood that power wasn't about badges or guns or money. Power was about courage, truth, and the willingness to stand up when everyone else sat. Tom had been elected sheriff in a proper election. Margaret Chun, the Chinese laundress whose son Dalton's deputy had beaten, had opened a restaurant. The town council now included 2 women, small changes but meaningful ones. And it had started with one waitress refusing. "We changed it," Clara corrected. "All of us. I just spoke first. Sometimes speaking first is the hardest part." Clara thought about that night, about the fear and rage that had driven her to confront Dalton, about the woman she was now seen, heard, valued. Yes, she agreed, touching the jade pendant Margaret Chun had given her, now worn every day as a talisman. Below them, Copper Ridge settled into evening. A town that had learned justice was worth fighting for. That ordinary people possessed extraordinary power. Not the piece of finished work. There would always be more injustices to fight, more systems to reform, more voices to amplify. But the peace of knowing she'd used her life well, that she'd spoken when silence would have been easier. People laughed, talked, lived their lives in a town where corruption no longer went unchallenged. And Clara Bennett stood watching it all, this woman who'd been invisible until she refused to be. This waitress who'd become some. 5 years had passed since that night in the Red Canyon Saloon, and Clara stood at the window of the schoolhouse watching dust devils dance across the desert. Her students were bent over their slates, scratching out arithmetic problems, their faces scrunched in concentration. The door opened and a girl slipped inside late, disheveled, with a black eye blooming purple across her left cheek. Sarah Morrison, 14 years old, daughter of Jake Morrison, defiant and ashamed in equal measure, daring anyone to comment while desperately hoping no one would. It was the same look Clara had worn for years, the face of someone who'd learned that invisibility was safer. Sarah Morrison staying after class meant trouble, meant another lecture, another punishment. The girl had been late 17 times this semester, had gotten into 3 fights, and had a habit of talking back that made the other teachers throw. The school day ended with the usual chaos of children escaping into afternoon sunshine. Sarah remained at her desk, arms crossed, jaw set, ready for whatever punishment Clara would deliver. Instead, Clara pulled a chair up beside the girl and sat down. "How did you get the Let people say whatever they want about my family? Let them treat me like I'm dirt because of what my father did?" The question hung in the air between them. And Clara remembered standing in the Red Canyon Saloon, facing those same choices, silence or speech. You fight with truth, with excellence, with becoming so undeniably valuable that they can't dismiss you. She paused. "Your father made his choices. You make yours. Every day, you get to decide who Sarah Morrison is going to be." Clara reached out and gently touched the girl's shoulder. "But fairness isn't guaranteed in this world, Sarah. Justice." "Then, Miss Bennett, is it true what they say? That you memorized Sheriff Dalton's ledger in 20 minutes? "Closer to 15, Clara admitted. "Fear has a way of sharpening your memory, and you really weren't." Sarah nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. "Miss Bennett, can I ask you something else?" Of course. Would you teach me? Extra lessons after school? Not just regular stuff. Everything. This was why she'd stayed in Copper Ridge. Why she'd chosen teaching over running away to somewhere she could be anonymous again. For moments like this, when a girl... They worked out a schedule 3 afternoons a week after regular classes ended, plus Saturday mornings. Sarah would help Clara clean the schoolhouse in exchange for the extra. Copper Ridge had grown in 5 years. New buildings, better roads, a telegraph office that connected them to the wider world. The town council had even discussed bringing electricity to Main Street, though most people thought that was a pipe dream. "How was school?" he asked, sliding her usual glass of water across the bar. "Complicated." Sarah Morrison got into another fight. Tom grimaced. "You can't help yourself, can you? Every lost cause, every difficult student, every person that everyone else has given up on, you take them under your wing. She's not a Miss Clara, you must come quick. My nephew, he's been arrested." Clara was on her feet immediately. "Arrested? For what?" "They say he stole from the general store, but he didn't. He's a good boy. After Dalton's execution, Copper Ridge had gone through 3 sheriffs, each one better than Dalton, but none truly good. Tom had finally won the position in a special election 2 years ago, and he'd hired a deputy named Frank Mitchell 6 months back. Mitchell had seemed capable. "Please, Miss Clara, you know Tom can help. You can help. My nephew's only 16. We'll handle it," Tom said, already untying his apron. He reached under the bar for the sheriff's badge he wore when not serving. "Tom and I will bring your nephew home." The jail was a 10-minute walk, but Clara used the time to question Margaret about what had happened. The story was simple and damning. Her nephew, Wei, had been looking at The jail was the same building where Dalton had once ruled, though Tom had done his best to transform it into something cleaner, more just. Still, walking inside made Clara's skin crawl with memories. The last time she'd been here was during... He was a big man in his 30s, with the kind of face that looked mean even in repose. When Tom and Clara entered, he glanced up with obvious irritation. "Sheriff. Miss Bennett." His tone made her name sound... Mitchell's gaze swiveled to her, cold and dismissive. "Don't recall asking for your input, ma'am. This is law enforcement business. And Tom is the sheriff, which means it's his business," Clara replied evenly. "So, and a Chinese kid grabbing a knife looks suspicious to me." Mitchell's expression hardened. You got a problem with how I do my job, Sheriff?" The challenge in his tone was unmistakable. Clara recognized the dynamic immediately, Mitchell testing Tom's authority. "Yes," Tom said quietly. "I have a problem with you arresting innocent people based on prejudice. Where's Wei now?" "In the back cell. And he's staying there until Judge Crawford comes through next week." "No, he's not." Tom's voice carried the weight of authority. "And if I don't?" The air in the office turned electric with tension. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Memories of Dalton pointing his gun at her chest, flooding back with visceral force. But Tom didn't flinch, didn't back down, just met his deputy's gaze with steady determination. She saw the calculation in his eyes. The same calculation she'd seen in Dalton's, weighing the risks, considering whether he could get away with violence. But then Mitchell saw something in Tom's expression, or perhaps in the way Clara stood ready to witness whatever happened next. He unpinned his deputy's badge and threw it on the desk. "Good luck finding someone else willing to deal with the kind of trouble this place attracts." He stormed out, shoulder-checking Tom on his way past. The door slammed behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. "Wei, you can come out now. You're free to go." The boy who emerged was thin and frightened, his eyes red from crying. He couldn't have been more than 16, with the kind of gangly build that suggested he'd grown too fast and hadn't figured out what... "I just wanted to look at the knife first. It was for my uncle's birthday." "We know," Clara said gently. "You didn't do anything wrong, Wei. The deputy made a mistake, and we're sorry for what you went through." It was the fear of people who knew that justice was conditional, that the wrong person in a position of power could destroy their lives on a whim. How many more were out there waiting for opportunities to abuse power? How many small injustices were happening every day that no one spoke up about because speaking up was... But what about people like Mitchell, the ones who hide behind law and order while treating certain people as less than human? Tom sighed. "I don't have an answer for that, Clara. I wish I did. All I can do is try to be fair." Clara thought about that as she climbed the stairs to her small room above the saloon. She thought about Wei Chun's frightened face, about Sarah Morrison's black eye, about all the small injustices that accumulated into larger patterns. But corruption was like desert weeds, pull one up and 2 more grew in its place. At the work of justice wasn't a single dramatic confrontation. It was endless, exhausting, requiring constant vigilance. The question was, she knew that protection was an illusion unless people actively fought to maintain it. Tomorrow she would teach her students about history and mathematics and literature. Because 5 years ago a terrified waitress had learned that silence was complicity, that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power, and that speaking truth to power could change everything. That lesson hadn't expired with Dalton's execution. The desert wind whispered through the streets, carrying the scent of sagebrush and possibility. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes howled their ancient songs. Above, stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky, each one a pinprick of light pushing back against darkness. Just like Claire